The autumn of 1847 brought more than changing leaves to the Texas frontier. It brought a hatred so deep that it turned neighbors into enemies and children into currency. In the dusty town of Millfield, where wooden buildings leaned against each other like broken promises, the auction block had seen many horrors. But nothing quite like what was about to unfold on this crisp October morning. 16-year-old. Catherine O'Sullivan pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the holding pen, her flame-red hair catching the morning sunlight like wildfire. Around her, other captives huddled in their own private miseries, but none drew the stares she did. None carried the mark that made grown men cross themselves and whisper about devils and demons. Her hair wasn't just red, it was the color of fresh blood, of sunset flames, of everything these frontier folk had been taught to fear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that would change Catherine O'Sullivan's life forever began like any other in the small Irish settlement of Green Valley, nestled in the rolling hills 30 miles east of what would later become Austin. She had risen before dawn, as was her custom, to tend to the vegetable garden that kept her family fed through the harsh Texas winters. Her red hair, braided long down her back, caught the first rays of sunlight as she worked among the potato plants and cabbage rows that her mother had planted with seeds brought all the way from County Cork. Catherine had inherited more than just her mother's hair. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to make things grow, to heal wounded animals, and to predict weather patterns with an accuracy that unnerved even her own family. The other Irish families in Green Valley called it a gift from God. The Protestant settlers in the surrounding areas whispered about something far more sinister. Her father, Sean O'Sullivan, had brought his family to Texas in 1845, fleeing the potato famine that was devastating Ireland. Like thousands of other Irish immigrants, he'd heard promises of cheap land and new opportunities in the Republic of Texas. What he hadn't anticipated was the depth of suspicion and hatred that would greet his Catholic family in this predominantly Protestant region. Sean worked as a blacksmith, his powerful arms shaping horseshoes and farming tools for anyone willing to pay, regardless of their feelings about Irish Catholics. His wife, Bridget, took in washing and mending, her clever fingers repairing clothes and linens for families who barely tolerated her presence. They were good people, hardworking and honest, but they carried the double burden of being both Irish and Catholic in a place where neither was welcome. Catherine's younger brother, Michael, had been born with a clubfoot that made walking difficult. At 12 years old, he was small for his age and required constant care. Her sister, little Mary, was only 8, with the same red hair as Catherine, but a personality as gentle as summer rain. The family struggled, but they survived, bound together by love and the fierce determination that had carried them across an ocean. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in late September, when Reverend Josiah Blackwood rode into Green Valley with a face like thunder and a heart full of righteous fury. Blackwood was a circuit preacher who served the Protestant communities scattered across 3 counties, a man who saw the hand of Satan in everything from card playing to dancing to the Catholic Mass. His sermons were legendary for their fire and brimstone. His hatred of Catholics was well known, and his influence over the scattered Protestant settlements was absolute. He had come to Green Valley because of reports that had reached him about Catherine O'Sullivan. Stories of a red-haired girl who could make dying plants bloom with just a touch. Tales of animals that followed her around like she was some kind of forest sprite. Accounts of her predicting the exact day that autumn rains would begin, 3 weeks before the first clouds appeared. To the Irish Catholics, these were signs of divine blessing. To Reverend Blackwood, they were evidence of demonic possession. The confrontation came during the weekly market day, when families from throughout the region gathered in Green Valley's small town square to trade goods and share news. Catherine was helping her mother sell vegetables from their garden when Blackwood's voice boomed across the crowd. "Behold!" he shouted, pointing directly at Catherine with a finger that shook with righteous indignation. "The spawn of Satan walks among us. See how her hair burns like the fires of hell. Witness how she practices the dark arts of witchcraft." The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning to Catherine, who stood frozen beside her mother's vegetable stand. Her red hair seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, and for a moment, even some of the Irish families looked at her with uncertainty. Bridget O'Sullivan stepped protectively in front of her daughter, but her hands were shaking. "That girl," Blackwood continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the square, "has been touched by the devil himself. Her unnatural powers are an abomination in the sight of the Lord. She corrupts everything she touches with her heathen magic." Sean O'Sullivan pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger. "You leave my daughter alone, preacher. She's done nothing wrong, nothing but help her family and neighbors." But Blackwood was just getting started. He had been planning this moment for weeks, gathering stories and building a case that would justify what he intended to do. "This child of Satan has bewitched your animals, your crops, your very thoughts. Her red hair is the mark of Cain, the sign that she belongs to the devil. She must be cleansed from our midst before she corrupts our children and brings God's wrath down upon us all." The crowd was beginning to murmur, fear and superstition overcoming reason. These were simple people, many of them barely literate, living hard lives on a dangerous frontier where death could come from Indian raids, disease, or starvation. They were hungry for someone to blame for their troubles, and Catherine's obvious differences made her an easy target. "What proof do you have?" Sean demanded, though his voice lacked conviction. He could see the mood of the crowd shifting, could feel the hostility growing like storm clouds on the horizon. Blackwood smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "The proof is written in her very appearance. Red hair is the mark of Judas Iscariot, the sign of those who betray the faithful. It is the brand that marks witches and demon worshippers. And her powers, her unnatural abilities with plants and animals, these are the gifts of Satan himself." Catherine found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I've never hurt anyone. I've only tried to help. The devil's lies come wrapped in pretty words." Blackwood thundered. "Just as Eve tempted Adam with sweet promises, so does this red-haired sorceress seek to lead us into damnation." The crowd was growing larger and more agitated. Protestant families who had never spoken to the O'Sullivans were nodding in agreement with Blackwood's words. Even some of the Irish Catholics were beginning to look uncertain, their faith in Catherine shaken by the preacher's passionate accusations. What happened next would haunt Catherine for the rest of her life. A group of Protestant settlers, emboldened by Blackwood's words and driven by years of accumulated resentment against the Irish immigrants, decided to take action. They had been looking for an excuse to drive the Catholics out of their region, and the preacher's accusations gave them the justification they needed. Led by a man named Jeremiah Cain, whose own failures as a farmer he blamed on the presence of Catholics in the area, the mob grew larger and more violent as the afternoon wore on. They began with demands that the O'Sullivan family leave Green Valley immediately. When Sean refused, saying he had paid for his land fair and square, the situation escalated rapidly. "She's bewitched them all," Cain shouted, pointing at Catherine. "Look how she stands there, defiant in the face of God's judgment. She's cast a spell on her own family." The truth was that Catherine was terrified beyond words, frozen in place by fear so overwhelming that she couldn't even speak. But to the angry crowd, her silence looked like arrogance, her stillness like supernatural composure. As evening approached, the mob's anger reached a breaking point. Rocks began flying toward the O'Sullivan family. Windows in Irish homes were shattered. Catholic families who had lived peacefully in Green Valley for years suddenly found themselves under attack by neighbors they had considered friends. The violence that followed was swift and merciless. The O'Sullivan home was set ablaze while the family huddled together in their root cellar, listening to the roar of flames consuming everything they owned. When they finally emerged, coughing and choking on smoke, they found their entire world destroyed. Sean O'Sullivan had been beaten unconscious trying to protect his property. Bridget clutched little Mary and Michael, both children sobbing with terror. And Catherine stood in the ruins of her family's life, her red hair seeming to glow in the light of the burning house, understanding for the first time that her very existence was seen as a threat by people who would never accept her. Reverend Blackwood watched the destruction with satisfaction, seeing it as God's will being carried out through righteous anger. But he wasn't finished with Catherine O'Sullivan. He had bigger plans for the red-haired girl he considered an agent of Satan. "This is just the beginning," he told Jeremiah Kane as they watched the O'Sullivan house burn. "That girl is too dangerous to simply drive away. She spread her evil. Wherever she goes, we need a more permanent solution." The permanent solution Blackwood had in mind involved the slave auction block in Millfield, where desperate people were sometimes sold into indentured servitude to pay debts or as punishment for crimes. It was technically illegal to sell free white people into slavery, but the law was often ignored on the frontier, especially when the victims were Irish Catholics with no powerful friends to protect them. Over the next week, as the O'Sullivan family camped in the ruins of their former life, Blackwood worked behind the scenes to arrange Catherine's fate. He spread stories about her supernatural powers to anyone who would listen, building a case that she was too dangerous to remain free. He found sympathetic ears among Protestant settlers who had their own reasons for wanting to see Irish Catholics. Driven from the region. The legal pretense came when Jeremiah Kane filed charges claiming that Catherine had used witchcraft to curse his crops, causing them to fail and leaving his family in debt. It was a ridiculous accusation with no evidence to support it, but in a community where the judge, jury, and witnesses were all Protestant settlers who already believed Catherine was possessed by the devil, evidence was unnecessary. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. Catherine was not allowed to speak in her own defense. Her father's testimony was dismissed as the lies of a man under his daughter's spell. The verdict was predetermined: guilty of practicing witchcraft and causing harm to Christian families through supernatural means. The sentence was equally predetermined: indentured servitude for a period of 7 years, to be sold at public auction to the highest bidder. It was a death sentence disguised as justice, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. No one expected Catherine O'Sullivan to survive 7 years of slavery on the Texas frontier. As Catherine was led away in chains, her red hair covered by a rough burlap sack that was supposed to hide her mark of the devil, she could hear her mother's sobs echoing across the courtroom. Her father's voice, hoarse from shouting protests, calling for justice that would never come. Her siblings crying for a sister they would never see again. But Catherine O'Sullivan was stronger than anyone realized. The same Irish spirit that had carried her family across an ocean would carry her through whatever horrors lay ahead. She didn't know that her red hair, the very feature that had brought her so much suffering, would soon be seen in a completely different light by people who understood that some differences were not curses, but gifts from the spirits themselves. The wagon that carried her toward Millfield moved slowly through the autumn landscape, each mile taking her further from everything she had ever known and closer to a destiny that none of them could have imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The town of Millfield squatted in the Texas dust like a wound that refused to heal. Built hastily around a crossroads where cattle drives met merchant wagons, it existed for one purpose: commerce of the darkest kind. By 1847, The settlement had grown into a hub where desperate people were bought and sold like livestock, where debts were paid in human flesh, and where the law looked the other way as long as the right palms were greased. Catherine arrived in Millfield on a Thursday evening, her wrists raw from the iron shackles that had chafed against her skin during the 3-day journey from Green Valley. The wagon driver, a weathered man named Tobias Fletcher, who made his living transporting human cargo, had barely spoken to her during the trip. When he did acknowledge her presence, it was only to mutter prayers under his breath or make signs against evil, as if her very proximity might contaminate his soul. The holding pen where Catherine spent her final night of relative privacy was a converted barn behind the auction house, its stalls filled with people whose only crime had been poverty, difference, or simply being in the wrong place when powerful men decided they needed scapegoats. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, desperation, and the peculiar smell of fear that seemed to seep from the wooden walls themselves. In the stall next to Catherine's, a Mexican woman named Isabella Morales clutched her infant son, both of them scheduled to be sold together to pay her dead husband's gambling debts. Across the narrow aisle, an elderly German immigrant named Heinrich Weber sat in stunned silence, still unable to comprehend how a land dispute with his neighbor had led to accusations of theft and a sentence of indentured servitude. "What did you do, girl?" Isabella whispered when the guards were out of earshot, her accent thick with the desperation of someone grasping for human connection in an inhuman place. "You're so young. What could you have possibly done?" Catherine pulled the rough blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to hide the red hair that had caused her so much suffering. "They say I'm touched by the devil," she replied quietly, her voice hoarse from crying, "because of my hair. Because I can make plants grow better than others." Isabella's eyes widened with understanding rather than fear. In her culture, red hair was sometimes seen as a mark of passion and strength, not evil. "Ay Dios mío," she murmured. "They fear what they don't understand. My grandmother had hair like fire when she was young. She could heal with herbs and predict the rains. People came from villages all around for her help." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Whitman, the auction house owner who had built his fortune on human misery. Whitman was a tall, thin man with the pale complexion of someone who spent his days indoors, counting money while others suffered in the sun. He moved through the holding pens with the efficiency of a livestock inspector, evaluating his merchandise with cold, calculating eyes. When he reached Catherine's stall, his expression shifted from mere professional interest to something approaching hunger. He had already heard the stories about the red-haired Irish girl who was supposedly possessed by demons. Such exotic merchandise could command premium prices from the right buyers, men who collected oddities and mysteries for their own twisted purposes. "Remove the covering," Whitman ordered Fletcher, who reluctantly pulled the burlap sack from Catherine's head. Her red hair tumbled free, catching the lamplight liquid flame, and Whitman's smile grew wider. "Perfect," he murmured. "Absolutely perfect. We'll put her up first tomorrow morning when the crowd is fresh and eager to bid." Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. Despite his profession, he retained enough humanity to feel uneasy about what was planned for the girl. "Sir, she's just a child. Maybe we could. She's merchandise," Whitman cut him off sharply. "Nothing more, nothing less. And she's going to make us both very wealthy. I've already had inquiries from 3 different buyers who are specifically interested in acquiring someone with her unique characteristics." That night, Catherine lay on the straw-covered floor of her stall, listening to the whispered prayers and muffled sobs of her fellow prisoners. Through gaps in the barn walls, she could see stars wheeling overhead in the vast Texas sky, the same stars that had shone over her family's farm in Green Valley just days earlier. It felt like a lifetime ago. Isabella's soft voice drifted across the darkness. "Listen to me, Nina," she said urgently. Tomorrow, when they put you on the block, remember this. You are not what they say you are. You are not evil. You are not cursed. You are a child of God, no matter what these men believe." The words brought Catherine little comfort, but they were the only kindness she had received since leaving her family, and she clung to them like a drowning person clutches driftwood. Dawn brought the sounds of preparation as Millfield's weekly auction drew crowds from across the region. Catherine could hear the clatter of wagon wheels on dirt roads, the neighing of horses, and the voices of men discussing prices and prospects, with the casual tone of farmers talking about livestock. The holding pen filled with the smell of coffee and frying bacon as food vendors set up their stalls, turning human suffering into a carnival atmosphere. Marcus Whitman appeared early, dressed in his finest coat and carrying a leather portfolio, filled with documentation for each person to be sold. He studied Catherine with the satisfaction of a man who knew he was about to make a significant profit. "Today is your lucky day, girl," he said with mock cheerfulness. "You're going to find yourself a new home, new purpose. Of course, it won't be the comfortable life you Irish Catholics think you deserve, but it will be exactly what you've earned through your wickedness." Catherine was given a bucket of cold water to wash with and a clean but rough dress to wear. Whitman wanted his merchandise to look presentable but not comfortable. Her red hair was brushed until it shone like polished copper, then left loose around her shoulders to emphasize the feature that made her so valuable to certain types of buyers. The auction block stood in the center of Millfield's main square, a wooden platform elevated just high enough to give everyone in the crowd a clear view of the human beings being sold. By 9 in the morning, nearly 200 people had gathered, their faces showing the mixture of curiosity, greed, and moral discomfort that always accompanied such events. Reverend Blackwood had made the journey from Green Valley specifically to witness Catherine's sale, positioning himself near the front of the crowd where she would be forced to see his satisfied expression. Beside him stood several of the men who had driven her family from their home, all of them eager to watch the final chapter of what they considered divine justice. But there were other faces in the crowd, ones that Catherine didn't recognize and couldn't interpret. Men with sun-weathered skin and hard eyes who seemed to be evaluating her for purposes she couldn't imagine. A well-dressed gentleman from Houston who collected what he called specimens for private study. A plantation owner from Louisiana who had heard rumors about her supernatural abilities and wanted to test whether she could improve his crop yields. Marcus Whitman climbed onto the platform with the theatrical flair of a man who understood the importance of showmanship in his gruesome profession. He raised his hands for silence, and the crowd gradually quieted, eager to see what exotic merchandise would be offered first. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitman began, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "we begin today's proceedings with a truly unique offering. A 16-year-old Irish girl with characteristics that I guarantee you have never seen before and will likely never see again." He gestured dramatically, and Fletcher led Catherine up the steps to the platform. As she emerged into full view of the crowd, a collective gasp arose from the assembled buyers. Her red hair seemed to catch fire in the morning sunlight, creating an almost supernatural aura around her pale, frightened face. "Behold," Whitman continued, warming to his performance, "Catherine O'Sullivan, known throughout 3 counties as the Devil's Daughter for her unnatural powers and demonic appearance, convicted of witchcraft by a proper court of law and sentenced to 7 years of indentured servitude." The crowd pressed closer, some people crossing themselves while others leaned forward with unholy interest. Catherine stood frozen in the center of the platform, her hands shaking as hundreds of eyes examined her like she was an animal at market. "Note the unusual coloration of her hair," Whitman continued, roughly grabbing a handful of Catherine's red locks and holding them up to catch the light. "This is not the normal red hair you might see occasionally among the Irish. This is the true mark of Satan himself, hair the color of hellfire, proof of her supernatural nature." A voice from the crowd called out, What can she do? What are these powers you mention? Whitman smiled, having anticipated the question. According to sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, this girl can make crops grow in barren soil, can heal dying animals with a touch, and can predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. Whether these abilities come from heaven or hell, I leave to your own judgment, but they are real and documented. The bidding began tentatively. $50 from the plantation owner, who saw potential profit in Catherine's alleged agricultural abilities. $75 from a cattle rancher who thought she might be useful in treating sick livestock. $100 from the gentleman collector, who wanted her for purposes he didn't specify, but which made Catherine's skin crawl. As the price climbed, Catherine felt herself becoming smaller and smaller, reduced to nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. The faces in the crowd blurred together into a mass of greed and curiosity, none of them showing any recognition of her humanity. Then, cutting through the noise of the auction like a knife through cloth, came a voice that changed everything. $200. The crowd turned as one toward the source of this unexpected bid. At the edge of the square, where the buildings gave way to open prairie, sat a group of horsemen who had arrived so quietly that nobody had noticed them. They were Comanche warriors, their horses restless beneath them, their presence transforming the entire atmosphere of the auction. The man who had spoken was clearly their leader, though he looked nothing like the savage that white settler stories had taught Catherine to expect. He was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and bearing that spoke of natural authority. His clothing mixed traditional Comanche elements with practical frontier gear, and he sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. Marcus Whitman's face went pale. Comanche raiders occasionally appeared in the settlements, sometimes to trade, sometimes to take what they wanted by force. But they had never before participated in a slave auction, and their presence here was both unexpected and deeply unsettling. That is ... double quotes Whitman stammered, unsure how to proceed. Sir, this auction is for civilized buyers only. You don't typically what? The Comanche leader asked, his English perfectly clear and educated. Accept legal currency from customers willing to pay your asking price? My money is as good as any man's here. The crowd murmured nervously, torn between racist assumptions about Indians and the very real fear of offending armed Comanche warriors who clearly outnumbered the local sheriff and his deputies. Several people began edging toward the exits, unwilling to be caught in the middle if violence erupted. The bid stands at $200, the Comanche leader continued calmly. Do I hear any higher offers? The other potential buyers suddenly found themselves reluctant to compete against Comanche warriors for possession of a girl they weren't sure they wanted badly enough to die for. The plantation owner from Louisiana decided his curiosity about supernatural agricultural abilities wasn't worth risking a scalping. The gentleman collector realized that his eccentric hobby might cost him his life. $200 going once, Whitman called out weakly, his showmanship completely deflated by the unexpected turn of events. $200 going twice ... Catherine stood on the platform, her mind reeling with confusion and terror. She had heard the stories about Comanche raids, about white captives tortured and killed or adopted into the tribe. Was this really better than being sold to a plantation or collector? Would she survive long enough to find out? The Comanche leader's eyes met hers across the crowded square, and for a moment, Catherine saw something she hadn't expected: recognition. Not the hungry evaluation of the other bidders, but a look of understanding, almost of reverence. Sold, Whitman finally called out, eager to complete the transaction before something went wrong. To the ... gentleman. For $200. As the Comanche leader dismounted and approached the platform with a leather pouch full of silver coins, Catherine realized that her life was about to change once again in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. The same red hair that had marked her as the devil's daughter to her Protestant neighbors was about to be seen through completely different eyes by people who understood that some differences were not curses, but gifts from the spirit world itself. The crowd began to disperse quickly, eager to distance themselves from the uncomfortable reality of what they had just witnessed. But Catherine remained on the platform, waiting to learn whether she had been rescued or simply sold into a different kind of hell. The silver coins clinked softly as they fell from the leather pouch into Marcus Whitman's trembling hands. Each piece seemed to burn his palm, though whether from the metal's temperature or his own conscience, he couldn't say. The Comanche leader counted out the payment with methodical precision, his dark eyes never leaving Whitman's face, as if memorizing every detail of the man who sold human beings for profit. "The transaction is complete," the leader said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made several nearby settlers take involuntary steps backward. "The girl comes with us now." Catherine descended the auction platform on unsteady legs, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Around her, the crowd continued to disperse with unusual haste, but she could feel eyes watching from windows and doorways as word spread through Millfield that Comanche warriors had just purchased a white girl at public auction. The Comanche leader approached her with movements that were both confident and respectful, stopping just close enough to speak without having to raise his voice. "My name is Thomas Running Bear," he said in English that carried only the slightest trace of accent. "I am war chief of the southern band of the Numunu, the people you call Comanche. You will ride with us now." Catherine found her voice, though. It came out as barely more than a whisper. "Are you going to kill me?" The question seemed to genuinely surprise Thomas Running Bear. His weathered features softened slightly, and when he spoke again, his tone held something that might have been compassion. "Child, if we intended you harm, we would not have paid good silver for you. There are easier ways to take captives than participating in white man's auctions." One of the younger warriors, whose scarred face told stories of numerous battles, urged his horse closer and spoke rapidly in Comanche. Catherine couldn't understand the words, but the tone seemed urgent, almost worried. Thomas Running Bear replied in the same language, his voice firm and commanding. The exchange ended with the younger warrior nodding reluctantly and riding back to his position with the others. "Joseph Broken Lance believes we should leave immediately," Thomas explained to Catherine. "He thinks the townspeople may organize pursuit once they overcome their initial shock. He is probably correct, but we will not run like thieves in the Cove. Knight, we paid honestly for you, and we will depart with dignity." A horse was brought forward, a sturdy pink mare with intelligent eyes and a gentle disposition. Catherine had ridden before all farm children learned basic horsemanship, but never bareback, and never while wearing a dress. Thomas Running Bear seemed to understand her hesitation. "White Dove has carried many riders," he said, stroking the mare's neck. "She will not let you fall. And we will not travel fast today. There's no need to punish you with discomfort, simply because circumstances require travel." As Catherine struggled to mount the horse while maintaining modesty in her dress, one of the other warriors dismounted and approached. This was an older man, perhaps 60 years old, with gray threading through his black hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. He carried himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to respect, and when he spoke, the other warriors listened with obvious deference. "This is Samuel Wise Owl," Thomas explained as the older man studied Catherine with intense curiosity. "He is our medicine man, keeper of our traditions and interpreter of signs. He has been very eager to meet you." Samuel Wise Owl spoke in Comanche, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that sounded almost like singing. Thomas listened carefully, then translated with obvious difficulty, as if the concepts didn't transfer easily between languages. "He says your hair carries the color of sacred fire, the flame that burns in the heart of the earth where the spirits dwell. He says you are marked by the Great Spirit for purposes that are not yet revealed. but which will become clear when the time is right. Catherine touched her hair self-consciously, still struggling to comprehend that the same feature which had brought her so much suffering was now being described in terms of blessing rather than curse. I don't understand. All my life people have said my hair was a mark of evil. Samuel Wise Owl seemed to understand more English than he spoke, because he responded immediately to her words, again in Comanche, but with obvious passion. Thomas's translation carried a hint of suppressed anger. He says white men have forgotten how to see the sacred in the natural world. They fear what they should revere, and they destroy what they should protect. Your hair is not a curse, it is a gift from the fire spirits, who chose you to carry their power in the world of men. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of several townspeople, led by Sheriff Benjamin Hayes, a man whose authority came more from his willingness to look the other way than from any particular competence at law enforcement. Hayes was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but felt obligated to make some show of official concern. "Now see here," Hayes began, his voice lacking conviction. "I'm not sure this transaction is entirely legal. The girl is white, and there are laws about—" Thomas Running Bear turned to face the sheriff with a movement so fluid and controlled that it seemed almost predatory. "Are you suggesting that the auction was conducted illegally? That your town officials knowingly participated in unlawful activity? I find that very interesting, Sheriff Hayes." The use of his name clearly unnerved Hayes, who hadn't expected the Comanche leader to know his identity. Thomas continued before the sheriff could respond, his voice taking on a tone of dangerous politeness. "The girl was sold at legal public auction by properly appointed officials. I paid the asking price in legal tender. The transaction was witnessed by 200 citizens of your community. Are you now claiming that your own legal system is invalid?" Sheriff Hayes found himself trapped by the logic of the argument. If he declared the sale invalid, he would be admitting that the town had been conducting illegal auctions. If he allowed it to stand, he would be accepting that Comanche warriors could legally purchase white captives. Either way, he was acknowledging realities that made him deeply uncomfortable. That is, the sale appears to have been conducted according to proper procedures, Hayes finally admitted. "I just want to make sure the girl understands her situation." Thomas Running Bear looked at Catherine, his expression making it clear that the choice was hers to make. "Do you wish to remain here, Catherine O'Sullivan? Do you prefer to trust your fate to these people who sold you like livestock?" Catherine looked around the square at the faces watching her from doorways and windows. She saw fear, suspicion, and a burning curiosity that had nothing to do with concern for her welfare. These were the same kinds of people who had driven her family from their home, who had branded her as evil because of her appearance, who had sold her into bondage without a moment's consideration for her humanity. "No," she said quietly, then louder. "No, I don't want to stay here." Thomas Running Bear nodded with satisfaction. "Then we leave now, before these good Christian folk decide they made a mistake in allowing Comanche warriors to participate in Kofung, their righteous commerce." The band moved out of Millfield at a steady pace, neither hurried nor leisurely, their formation designed to protect Catherine in the center while maintaining readiness for potential trouble. Catherine rode between Thomas Running Bear and Samuel Wise Owl, still struggling to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. As the buildings of Millfield disappeared behind them, replaced by the endless expanse of Texas prairie, Catherine felt a strange mixture of terror and relief. She was leaving behind everything familiar, riding into the unknown with people she had been taught to fear. But she was also escaping from a world that had rejected her completely, that had seen her differences as evidence of evil rather than uniqueness. The landscape around them was harsh but beautiful. Rolling grasslands dotted with mesquite trees and occasional rock formations that rose from the earth like ancient monuments. The sky stretched overhead in a dome of blue so vast that it seemed to dwarf human concerns. And for the first time in weeks, Catherine felt like she could breathe freely. Samuel Wiseowl began to sing as they rode, his voice carrying melodies that seemed to harmonize with the rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through grass. The other warriors occasionally joined in, creating music that was unlike anything Catherine had ever heard, wild and free and somehow connected to the land itself. "He sings about the fire spirits," Thomas explained during a pause in the music. "He says they are welcoming you home, that you have been lost among people who couldn't understand your true nature. But now you are returning to those who can teach you what your gifts really mean." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Catherine found herself relaxing slightly in the saddle. The initial terror of being captured by Comanche warriors was giving way to cautious curiosity about people who seemed to view her very differently than anyone had before. The revelation came when they stopped to water the horses at a creek that meandered through a grove of cottonwood trees. Samuel Wiseowl approached Catherine with a handful of dried grass and small twigs, then knelt beside the creek and began arranging them in patterns she didn't recognize. "Watch carefully," Thomas instructed. "Samuel wants to show you something about your gift." The medicine man spoke a few words in Comanche, then looked expectantly at Catherine. When she didn't respond, Thomas translated, "He wants you to touch the dried grass. Just touch it, nothing more." Catherine knelt beside the creek and reached out tentatively to touch the bundle of vegetation Samuel had prepared. The moment her fingers made contact, something extraordinary happened. The dried brittle grass began to turn green, as if spring rain was flowing through it. The small twigs sprouted tiny leaves, and flowers bloomed from stems that had appeared completely dead moments before. Catherine jerked her hand back in shock, but the transformation continued. Within minutes, the small bundle had become a miniature garden, lush and vibrant, despite having no soil or water beyond what the creek provided. Comanche warriors watched this display with obvious reverence rather than fear. Several of them spoke in their own language, their voices carrying tones of awe and respect. Samuel Wiseowl smiled broadly and spoke at length to Thomas, who translated with obvious excitement. "He says the fire spirits have marked you as their chosen vessel in this world. Your touch doesn't just heal, it transforms death into life, barrenness into abundance. This is why your hair burns with their sacred flame. You carry their power within you." Catherine stared at the impossible garden she had created, finally beginning to understand that her abilities were far more significant than anyone in Green Valley had realized. "But why me? I'm nobody special. I'm just a farmer's daughter." Samuel Wiseowl seemed to understand the question, because he responded immediately in Comanche, his voice gentle but intense. Thomas's translation carried the weight of prophecy. "He says the spirits choose their vessels not for their station in life, but for the strength of their hearts. You have endured suffering that would have broken weaker souls. You have maintained your goodness despite being surrounded by hatred. This is why you were chosen." As evening approached and the band prepared to make camp, Catherine realized that her journey was far from over. She had escaped from one world and entered another, but her true destiny was still unfolding. The same red hair that had marked her as the devil's daughter was revealing itself as something far more profound, a sign that she carried within herself the power to transform not just dried grass into living gardens, but perhaps entire worlds. From hatred into understanding, the fire spirits had marked her for purposes she was only beginning to comprehend. And among the Comanche, she would finally learn what those purposes might be. The Comanche village appeared on the horizon like a mirage materializing from the endless Texas grassland, as if it had always been there, waiting. Catherine had been riding with the war party for 3 days, each mile taking her further from the world she had known and deeper into a realm where her red hair drew looks of wonder rather than fear, where her presence was anticipated rather than dreaded. the camp stretched along the banks of a river whose name she couldn't pronounce, its Comanche syllables flowing like water over stones when Thomas Running Bear spoke them aloud. Dozens of buffalo-hide tipis rose from the prairie. Grass in careful arrangement, their geometric patterns telling stories she was only beginning to learn to read. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward in thin columns, carrying the scent of roasted meat and unfamiliar herbs that made her stomach remind her she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. As their horses approached the camp's perimeter, Catherine felt her anxiety return with renewed intensity. She had grown somewhat comfortable with Thomas Running Bear and his warriors during their journey, but now she would face an entire community of people whose language she didn't speak, whose customs she didn't understand, and whose reaction to her presence remained completely unknown. Children spotted the returning war party first, their excited shouts bringing adults from tipis and work areas. Catherine expected to see the savage faces that populated white settlers' nightmares, but instead found herself looking at people whose expressions ranged from curiosity to anticipation to something that might have been joy. Women in beautifully decorated dresses emerged to greet returning husbands and sons. Elderly men smoking long pipes nodded approvingly at the successful conclusion of the journey. Even the dogs seemed to welcome the war party home with enthusiasm rather than alarm. "They have been expecting you," Thomas Running Bear explained as he guided his horse through the camp toward its center. "Samuel Wise Owl sent word ahead through our scout network. The entire village knows about the fire hair woman who was sold like a slave but has come home to the people at last." Catherine winced at the title, still uncomfortable with any reference to her distinctive coloring, but the way Thomas spoke made it clear that among the Comanche, fire hair woman carried connotations of honor rather than shame. She was beginning to understand that her red hair wasn't just accepted here, it was celebrated as proof of her connection to spiritual forces that the Comanche revered. The war party came to a halt in the center of the village, where a large tipi decorated with symbols Catherine couldn't interpret stood apart from the others. This, Thomas explained, was the lodge of Chief Iron Horse, the political leader of this particular band, who would make the final decision about Catherine's place among the people. Chief Iron Horse emerged from his lodge with the deliberate dignity of a man accustomed to command. He was older than Thomas Running Bear, perhaps 50 years old, with silver threading through hair that hung to his shoulders and scars that spoke of a lifetime spent defending his people. But his eyes held intelligence and compassion that immediately put Catherine somewhat at ease. Samuel Wise Owl dismounted and approached the chief, speaking rapidly in Comanche while gesturing toward Catherine. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other tribal elders joining the discussion. Catherine caught occasional English words mixed in with the Comanche: fire spirit, sacred sign, prophecy fulfilled, but couldn't follow the overall meaning. Finally, Chief Iron Horse approached Catherine's horse, looking up at her with an expression of solemn evaluation. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear, each word chosen with precision. "Welcome, Fire Woman. I am Iron Horse, chief of the southern band of the Namunu. Samuel Wise Owl tells me you carry the mark of the fire spirits, that you have been chosen to bring their power to our people. Is this true?" Catherine struggled to find words that could convey the complexity of her situation. "I don't know about spirits or prophecies. I only know that I can sometimes make plants grow better than others, and that this ability has brought me nothing but trouble among my own people." Iron Horse translated her response for the gathered crowd, which had grown to include most of the village's adult population. The discussion that followed was animated but respectful, with various voices offering opinions while the chief listened carefully to each speaker. "The people are curious about your abilities," Iron Horse explained. When the discussion subsided, "Samuel Wise Owl has told them what he witnessed at the creek, but many wish to see for themselves. Would you be willing to demonstrate your gift?" Before Catherine could respond, a commotion arose from the edge of the crowd. A woman pushed through the gathered villagers, carrying something wrapped in a blanket. She was perhaps 30 years old, with the weathered face of someone who had endured great sorrow, and tears streaming down her cheeks as she approached Chief Iron Horse. The woman spoke urgently in Comanche, occasionally pointing to the bundle in her arms. As she talked, other women began to nod sympathetically, and Catherine could see that whatever the woman was describing had deeply moved the entire community. "This is Evening Star," Thomas Running Bear translated quietly. "Her infant son has been sick for many days. The fever burns in him, and our traditional medicines have not helped. She asks if the fire hair woman might touch the child, to see if the fire spirits can drive away the sickness." Catherine felt her heart sink with familiar dread. This was exactly the kind of situation that had led to accusations of witchcraft back in Green Valley. If she tried to help and failed, would these people also turn against her? If she succeeded, would they expect miracles she couldn't consistently deliver? "I'm not a healer," she said desperately. "I don't know anything about medicine. I've never tried to help a sick person before." Samuel Wiseowl stepped forward, speaking gently but firmly in English that was more heavily accented than Thomas's. "Or iron horses. Fire spirits work through chosen vessels whether vessel understands or not. Child is dying. What harm can come from trying? If spirits wish to help, they will help. If not, child dies anyway, but mother knows all possible paths were explored." The terrible logic of the situation settled over Catherine like a weight. The infant was dying, and she was being asked to attempt something she didn't understand using abilities she couldn't control. But the alternative was to watch a baby die without even trying to help. "I'll try," she said quietly, dismounting from White Dove with hands that trembled from more than just fatigue. "But I can't promise anything." Evening Star approached with desperate hope shining in her eyes, carefully unwrapping the bundle to reveal a baby boy who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. The child was burning with fever, his tiny chest rising and falling with labored breathing that spoke of serious illness. His lips were cracked with dehydration, and his eyes were glassy with the particular look that meant death was not far away. Catherine knelt beside Evening Star, her heart pounding with fear and uncertainty. The entire village had fallen silent, watching this crucial moment that would determine not just the baby's fate, but Catherine's place among the people. She reached out tentatively, then pulled her hand back, terrified of the responsibility being placed on her shoulders. "I don't know what to do," she whispered to Samuel Wiseowl. The medicine man knelt beside her, his voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent mediating between the human and spirit worlds. "Do not think. Do not try to control. Simply touch child with open heart and let fire spirits decide what should happen. You are vessel, not source. Water does not choose where to flow, it follows path that earth provides." Catherine took a deep breath and gently placed her hands on the baby's chest. For a moment, nothing happened, and she felt the familiar crushing weight of expected failure. Then, gradually she became aware of warmth flowing through her palms, a heat that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her and pass into the sick child. The baby's breathing began to deepen and slow, becoming less labored. The flush of fever started to fade from his cheeks, and his eyes began to focus with the clarity of returning health. Within minutes, he was looking around with curiosity rather than the glazed stare of illness, and shortly after that, he began to cry with the lusty voice of a healthy, hungry infant. Evening Star burst into tears of joy, clutching her son to her chest while speaking rapid thanks in Comanche. The crowd erupted in excited conversation, with many people pushing forward to get a closer look at the woman who had seemingly brought the dying child back to health. But Catherine felt no triumph, only a deep exhaustion that seemed to drain strength from her very bones. Whatever had happened, it had taken something from her to give life back to the baby. She swayed on her knees, and Thomas Running Bear quickly moved to support her before she could collapse. "The fire spirits have spoken," Samuel Wise Owl announced. To the crowd, his voice carrying across the entire village. "The Fire Woman is indeed their chosen vessel. She has brought their healing power to our people, as the prophecies foretold." Chief Iron Horse raised his hand for silence, and when the crowd quieted, he spoke with the authority of final decision. "The Fire Woman will remain among us as our guest and our sister. She will be given a place of honor in our village, and all our people will protect her as they would protect their own children. The fire spirits have blessed us with her presence." As the crowd began to disperse, still talking excitedly about what they had witnessed, Thomas Running Bear helped Catherine to her feet. She felt overwhelmed by the implications of what had just occurred, uncertain whether she had been blessed or cursed with abilities she couldn't understand or control. "What happens now?" she asked, still struggling to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. "Now you learn to live among the people," Thomas replied. "You will be given teachers who can help you understand your gifts. You will learn our language, our customs, our ways of seeing the world. And perhaps, in time, you will understand why the fire spirits chose you to carry their power." A young woman approached them, speaking shyly to Thomas in Comanche before turning to Catherine with a warm smile. She was perhaps 18 years old, with kind eyes and an air of gentle competence that immediately put Catherine at ease. "This is Dancing Cloud," Thomas explained. "She has volunteered to be your guide and teacher while you learn our ways. She speaks some English and has agreed to help you adapt to life among the people." Dancing Cloud spoke carefully in English, her accent making her words musical rather than difficult to understand. "Welcome, Fire Woman. I am honored to help you find your place among us. Come, I will show you where you will live and help you understand our customs." As Catherine followed Dancing Cloud toward a tipi that had been prepared for her arrival, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. In just a few days, she had gone from being auctioned as the devil's daughter to being welcomed as a sacred vessel among people who saw her differences as gifts rather than curses. But she was beginning to understand that this was only the beginning of her transformation. Living among the Comanche would require her to learn not just a new language and new customs, but an entirely new way of understanding herself and her place in the world. The fire spirits had marked her for purposes she was only beginning to glimpse, and among the people, she would finally have the opportunity to discover what those purposes might be. The tipi Dancing Cloud led her to was beautifully decorated, with symbols that seemed to tell stories of fire and wind, earth and sky. Inside, buffalo robes provided comfortable seating and sleeping areas, while personal items, clothing, tools, decorations waited to help her begin building a new life among people who valued her for exactly what she was rather than condemning her for what she could never change. As evening fell over the Comanche village, Catherine sat outside her new home, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. For the first time since childhood, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere, might actually have found people who could help her understand the gifts that had brought her so much suffering among her own kind. The journey from devil's daughter to fire spirit was far from complete. But among the people, she would finally have the chance to discover who she really was meant to be. The morning sun painted the buffalo hide walls of Catherine's tipi in shades of gold and amber as she awakened to sounds that were becoming familiar. The soft voices of women preparing morning meals, children laughing as they played games she was learning to understand, and the distant nickering of horses being readied for the day's activities. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival among the Comanche, and each day brought new revelations about a world she had never imagined could exist. Dancing Cloud appeared at the tipi entrance just as Catherine finished braiding her red hair in the style that marked her as an unmarried woman of the village. The young Comanche woman had become more than just a teacher. She was becoming the sister Catherine had never had, patient with her mistakes and generous with encouragement as Catherine struggled to learn not just language, but an entirely different way of seeing the world. "Good morning, Firehair Sister," Dancing Cloud said in English, though their lessons increasingly took place in Comanche as Catherine's vocabulary expanded. "Samuel Wiseowl wishes to speak with you after you break your fast. He says the fire spirits have been sending him dreams about your training." Catherine had learned that among the Comanche, dreams were not merely products of sleeping minds, but communications from the spirit world that required careful interpretation. Samuel Wiseowl's dreams about her had accurately predicted several events during her first weeks in the village, including a successful buffalo hunt and the arrival of traders from the eastern tribes, who brought news of white settlements expanding. Westward, the two women walked together toward the central area where the morning meal was being shared. Catherine still marveled at the casual generosity that characterized Comanche community life. Food was prepared collectively and shared freely, with particular attention paid to ensuring that elderly members, children, and visitors received the choicest portions. No one went hungry while others feasted, and no one was excluded from the community's abundance as they ate strips of dried buffalo meat and corn cakes sweetened with wild honey. Catherine found herself thinking about her family back in Green Valley. Were her parents still alive? Had her siblings recovered from the trauma of watching their sister sold into slavery? The letters she had written with Dancing Cloud's help, dictated in English and translated into Spanish for delivery through trading networks, had received no responses. She tried not to let the silence mean that her family was lost to her forever. "You grow sad when you think of your blood family," Dancing Cloud observed, her perceptiveness a constant reminder that among the Comanche, emotional subtleties were noticed and addressed rather than ignored. "But remember, Firehair Sister, that family is not only blood. The people who accept you, who care for your welfare, who celebrate your gifts, these also are family." The wisdom of the observation was undeniable. In 3 weeks among the Comanche, Catherine had received more acceptance and genuine care than she had experienced in years among her Irish Catholic neighbors. Her red hair, which had marked her as cursed among white settlers, was seen here as proof of her connection to sacred forces. Her abilities with plants and healing, which had led to accusations of witchcraft in Green Valley, were celebrated as evidence that the spirits had chosen her for important purposes. After the morning meal, Catherine made her way to Samuel Wiseowl's lodge, a tipi distinguished by the medicine bundles hanging from its support poles and the sweet smell of sage and sweetgrass that always surrounded the elderly medicine man. She had come to cherish these daily sessions, during which Samuel shared traditional knowledge while helping her understand the spiritual dimensions of her abilities. Samuel Wiseowl greeted her with the formal courtesy he showed to all spiritual matters, gesturing for her to sit on a buffalo robe, positioned directly across from his own seat. Between them lay an array of objects that Catherine was learning to recognize as tools for communicating with the spirit world: crystals, feathers, carved bones, and bundles of sacred plants. "The fire spirit spoke to me again in dreams," Samuel began without preamble, his English carefully chosen to convey concepts that didn't translate easily between cultures. "They showed me visions of your past and your future, Firehair Woman. They wish me to share these visions with you, but first you must understand more about the nature of your gifts." Over the past weeks, Samuel had been teaching Catherine about the Comanche understanding of spiritual power, how it flowed through the natural world, how certain individuals were chosen to channel it for the benefit of their communities, and how such gifts required careful training to avoid dangerous consequences. Catherine was learning that her abilities were far more complex and potentially powerful than she had ever realized. "Your people, the white settlers, fear power they cannot understand," Samuel continued, selecting an eagle feather from his collection of sacred objects. "They believe that strength must be controlled through force, that differences must be eliminated through violence. But the spirits teach us that true power comes from harmony, from understanding your place in the great web that connects all living things. He held the eagle feather toward the 4 directions, speaking briefly in Comanche before returning his attention to Catherine. In my dreams, the fire spirits showed me your childhood. I saw a little girl with hair like flame who could make flowers bloom in winter, who could heal injured animals with a touch, who could sense the needs of growing things before they could speak those needs aloud. But I also saw how your own people turned against you, how they taught you to fear your gifts instead of embracing them. The accuracy of his vision made Catherine's breath catch. She had never told anyone about the incidents from her childhood, the times when her touch had restored dying plants, when injured birds had healed in her hands, when she had somehow known exactly what the family garden needed to thrive. Her parents had dismissed these events as coincidence, and as she grew older, Catherine had learned to suppress her abilities rather than risk drawing unwanted attention. The spirits are angry about this, Samuel continued, his voice taking on a tone of righteous indignation. They chose you to be their vessel in the world of humans, but your people tried to make you deny your nature. This is why your powers grew wild and unpredictable. This is why healing the baby exhausted you so completely. You have been fighting against your own gifts for so long that you do not know how to work with them properly. Samuel reached for a bundle of sweetgrass, lighting it from the small fire that burned constantly in his lodge and letting the fragrant smoke drift around both of them. Today we begin your true training. Not just learning our language or our customs, but learning to understand and control the fire spirit power that flows through you. This training will be difficult and sometimes dangerous, but it is necessary if you are to fulfill the purpose for which you were chosen. The next several hours were unlike anything Catherine had ever experienced. Samuel guided her through meditation exercises designed to help her sense the flow of spiritual energy around and through her body. He taught her breathing techniques that could focus her abilities and mental disciplines that would allow her to direct her power with precision rather than simply hoping for the best. Feel the fire within your heart, Samuel instructed as Catherine sat with her eyes closed, following his guidance. Do not try to control it or suppress it. Simply observe how it moves, how it responds to your thoughts and emotions. The fire spirits are not your servants. You are their partner in the work of healing and growth. As Catherine learned to quiet her mind and pay attention to subtle sensations she had never noticed before, she began to perceive something extraordinary. There was indeed a warmth that seemed to originate somewhere deep inside her chest, a presence that felt alive and intelligent. When she focused on it with curiosity rather than fear, it seemed to respond with something that might have been approval. Now extend your awareness beyond your own body, Samuel continued. Feel the life force that flows through all living things. The grass beneath us, the trees that provide our shelter, the horses grazing nearby all carry the same essential energy that burns within you. Your gift is the ability to strengthen that energy, to encourage its growth and healing. The exercise continued until Catherine began to perceive the world around her in an entirely new way. Instead of seeing separate objects, people, animals, plants, she started to sense the web of connections that linked all living things. Every blade of grass, every insect, every human being pulsed with the same fundamental energy, differing only in intensity and pattern. This is the vision the fire spirits wish you to carry, Samuel explained as the session concluded. Your people see the world as a collection of separate things competing for scarce resources. The spirits see it as a single living system where the health of each part affects the wellness of the whole. Your role is to strengthen the connections, to help the system heal itself when it becomes damaged. As Catherine opened her eyes and returned to ordinary awareness, she felt as though she had awakened from a long dream. The world around her looked the same but felt completely different. She could sense the vitality flowing through Samuel's aging body, could perceive the needs of the plants growing near his lodge, could even detect the emotional states of people moving through the village beyond the tippy walls. "This is overwhelming," she admitted, struggling to process the flood of new perceptions. "How do you function with this much awareness? How do you keep from being constantly distracted by everything you can sense?" Samuel smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student was finally beginning to understand the lesson. "Practice, Fire Herman. Like learning to walk or speak, learning to control spiritual sight requires years of patient effort. But you will learn, because the spirits have chosen you for work that cannot be accomplished by ordinary humans." The afternoon brought a practical test of Catherine's expanding abilities. A group of warriors returned from patrol with disturbing news. White settlers were establishing a new town less than 50 miles to the east, bringing with them the usual collection of problems that accompanied territorial expansion. More immediately concerning, the warriors had discovered several areas where the prairie grass was dying for no apparent reason, creating brown patches that threatened to spread across the grazing lands the band depended on for their horses and the buffalo that sustained them. Chief Iron Horse called a council meeting to discuss the implications of these developments. Catherine was invited to attend, both as someone whose insights might prove valuable and as a demonstration of her growing integration into the community's decision-making processes. The council met in the largest tipi in the village, with representatives from every family group arranged in a circle that emphasized equality rather than hierarchy. Chief Iron Horse facilitated the discussion, but every voice was heard and every opinion considered before decisions were reached. The dying grassland presented a puzzle that troubled everyone present. The affected areas showed no signs of disease, insect damage, or drought stress. The grass simply appeared to be losing its life force, withering away despite adequate water and nutrients. Several of the older warriors suggested that this might be the work of enemy medicine men, while others wondered if the presence of white settlers was somehow poisoning the land itself. "Fire Hair Woman," Chief Iron Horse said, turning to Catherine with the respect that had characterized all her interactions with tribal leadership. "Your gifts are connected to the life force of growing things. Would you be willing to examine these damaged areas? Perhaps the fire spirits will reveal to you what our ordinary senses cannot detect." Catherine felt a familiar mixture of honor and terror at being asked to use abilities she was still learning to understand and control. But Samuel Wise Owl's training had given her new confidence in her connection to the spiritual forces that worked through her. "I'll do whatever I can to help," she replied, earning approving nods from around the circle. "When do we leave?" The expedition departed at dawn the following day, with Catherine riding alongside Thomas Running Bear and a small group of experienced scouts. The journey to the affected area took most of the morning, crossing prairie land that gradually transitioned from healthy grassland to patches of brown, dying vegetation that spread like a disease across the landscape. When they reached the most severely damaged area, Catherine dismounted and knelt beside the dying grass, placing her hands on the earth while trying to apply the techniques Samuel Wiseowl had taught her. At first, she sensed only the weakness and fading vitality that was visible to ordinary sight. But as she deepened her concentration, she began to perceive something more troubling. The land itself felt poisoned, not by any physical contamination, but by something that attacked the spiritual essence of growing things. It was as if someone had found a way to drain the life force from the earth itself, leaving behind soil that could support no healthy growth. The discovery filled Catherine with anger that surprised her with its intensity. This wasn't natural death or even the result of human carelessness. This was deliberate spiritual vandalism, an attack on the sacred forces that sustained all life. As her anger grew, she felt the fire spirit power within her responding with corresponding heat and energy. Without conscious intention, she began to channel that power into the damaged earth beneath her hands, offering her own life force to restore what had been stolen. The results were immediate and dramatic. Green shoots began pushing through the dead grass, not the slow growth of natural recovery, but the rapid transformation that marked supernatural intervention. Within minutes, the brown patch where she knelt had become a circle of vibrant, healthy grass that stood in stark contrast to the damaged area surrounding it. But the effort had cost her. Catherine swayed as she lifted her hands from the earth, and Thomas Running Bear moved quickly to support her before she could collapse. "Easy, fire hair woman," he said gently. "You've done enough for now. We understand what we're dealing with." As Catherine recovered her strength, Thomas explained what her demonstration had revealed. The dying grassland was indeed the result of spiritual attack, probably the work of a medicine man from a rival tribe who sought to drive the Comanche from their traditional grazing grounds. Such attacks were rare but not unknown, and they required specific countermeasures that went beyond ordinary healing. "This is why the fire spirits brought you to us," Thomas continued as they prepared to return to the village. "Your power is not just to heal individual sickness, but to restore spiritual balance when it has been deliberately disrupted. The people have been waiting for someone with your gifts for longer than you know." As they rode back toward the village, Catherine reflected on the magnitude of what she was learning about herself and her abilities. She was not just a healer, but a protector of the spiritual forces that sustained life itself. The same red hair that had marked her as the devil's daughter among white settlers was proving to be the sign of her role as a guardian of sacred power. But with that understanding came the recognition that her real work was just beginning. The white settlers establishing towns to the east represented a threat that went beyond competition for land or resources. They brought with them a worldview that denied the spiritual dimensions of existence, that sought to dominate rather than cooperate with the natural world. The fire spirits had marked her to serve as a bridge between worlds, to help preserve ancient wisdom while adapting to new challenges. Among the Comanche, she was finally learning what that meant and how to fulfill the destiny that her red hair had always proclaimed. The war drums echoed across the prairie like thunder that refused to fade, their rhythm carrying a message that every member of the Comanche band understood with chilling clarity. Enemies approached with hostile intent. Catherine had been living among the people for 2 months now, long enough to recognize the difference between ceremonial drumming and the urgent beats that summoned warriors to defend their families and homeland. She emerged from her tipi to find the village transforming with practiced efficiency. Warriors painted their faces with designs that told of their deeds and spiritual protections, while women gathered children and prepared for possible evacuation. The elderly took charge of securing valuable items and sacred objects that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, stamping and nickering restlessly as their riders prepared for battle. Thomas Running Bear approached her lodge at a run, his usually calm demeanor replaced by urgent concern. "Fire hair woman, you must come with me to the council lodge immediately. We have visitors, and their presence changes everything we thought we understood about the attacks on our grazing lands." Catherine followed him through the bustling village to Chief Iron Horse's lodge, where she found an emergency council session already in progress. But what shocked her was the identity of the visitors who had prompted this gathering. 3 Kiowa warriors, members of a tribe that had been at war with the Comanche for decades, their faces bearing the exhaustion of men who had ridden hard for many days. The lead Kiowa warrior was a man of perhaps 35 years, with scars that spoke of numerous battles and eyes that held the desperate intensity of someone carrying terrible news. When he spoke, his words came in a mixture of Kiowa, Comanche, and broken English, forcing Chief Iron Horse to translate for Catherine's benefit. "This is Striking Eagle of the Kiowa," Iron Horse explained, his voice heavy with the implications of what was being revealed. "He brings word that his people are suffering from the same spiritual attacks that have poisoned our grasslands. But the scale of the destruction is far worse than we realized. Striking Eagle continued his report, occasionally pulling out pieces of dried grass and withered plants to illustrate his words. As the translation continued, Catherine felt a growing horror at what was being described. Entire river valleys had been drained of life force, leaving behind landscapes where nothing could grow and animals sickened and died after drinking the water. Kiowa medicine men had attempted to counter the attacks, but their efforts had failed, and several had died from the spiritual backlash of their unsuccessful interventions. But this is the most troubling part, Iron Horse said, his translation taking on an even more grim tone. The attacks are not coming from rival tribes as we first believed. Striking Eagle scouts have identified the source, a white man who calls himself Dr. Ezekiel Blackthorne, who has established what he claims is a medical research facility in the hills 30 miles north of the new settlement of Cedar Falls. The name sent a chill through Catherine that had nothing to do with the October wind whistling through the lodge walls. She had heard whispers of such men, white settlers who sought to acquire and exploit the spiritual knowledge of indigenous peoples, often through methods that corrupted rather than honored the sacred traditions they claimed to study. Samuel Wise Owl, who had been listening to the discussion with growing alarm, spoke for the first time since the Kiowa warriors' arrival. His words were directed at Catherine, and his tone carried the weight of prophecy. The fire spirits warned me this day would come. They showed me visions of a false medicine man who seeks to steal the life force of the earth itself, to bend spiritual power to serve his own twisted purposes. You were brought to us to stand against this evil, Fire Hair Woman. Striking Eagle seemed to understand that Samuel was speaking about Catherine, because he turned to study her with intense curiosity. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of desperate hope that made Catherine's heart clench with responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. He asks if it's true that you can restore life to poisoned land, Iron Horse translated. His people are starving because their hunting grounds have been spiritually contaminated. Their horses are dying because the grass they depend on has been drained of nourishment. If you can heal what this blackthorn has poisoned, the Kiowa, offer alliance with the Comanche against this common enemy. The proposal was staggering in its implications. The Kiowa and Comanche had been enemies for generations, their conflicts rooted in competition for hunting grounds and ancient grievances that had claimed countless lives on both sides. But the threat posed by Dr. Blackthorne was evidently severe enough to overcome even these deep-seated hostilities. Chief, Iron Horse called for a brief recess to allow the council members to discuss this unprecedented situation. As the Kiowa warriors were escorted to a guest lodge where they could rest and receive food, Catherine found herself the center of intense debate about capabilities and responsibilities she was still learning to understand. The risk is enormous, Thomas Running Bear pointed out, his strategic mind already calculating the dangers involved in confronting a white man who possessed unknown spiritual abilities. We don't know what kind of powers this Blackthorn commands or what defenses he might have prepared. Sending Fire Hair Woman against him could result in her death or corruption. But if we do nothing, Samuel Wise Owl countered, the spiritual poison will continue to spread. Eventually, it will kill everything living on the plains. Our children will inherit a dead world where nothing can grow and no animals can survive. That is not a legacy the people can accept. Dancing Cloud, who had been granted permission to attend the council because of her role as Catherine's cultural guide, spoke with unusual boldness for someone of her age and gender. Fire Hair Woman should be allowed to choose for herself. She has proven her courage and her commitment to the people. This decision belongs to her. All eyes turned to Catherine, and she felt the weight of expectations that seemed impossibly heavy for someone who had been learning to control her abilities for just a few months. But as she considered the alternatives, allowing the spiritual corruption to spread unchecked, watching the land die while she remained safely hidden, she realized that the choice had already been made for her by forces larger than personal preference. I need to see the damage for myself, she said finally. I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before I can know whether my abilities are sufficient to counter it. But I won't abandon the people who welcomed me when my own kind rejected me. If there's any chance I can help, I have to try. The expedition that departed the following morning was unlike any war party in Comanche history. Catherine rode with Thomas Running Bear and a small group of elite warriors, accompanied by Samuel Wiseowl and 2 Kiowa guides who knew the location of Blackthorn's facility. The alliance between traditional enemies felt fragile but necessary. United by shared recognition that some threats transcended tribal boundaries, the journey north took them through increasingly desolate landscape as they approached the area under Blackthorn's influence. Catherine's newly developed spiritual senses allowed her to perceive the corruption long before it became visible to ordinary sight. The very air felt wrong, tainted with an energy that made her skin crawl and her stomach turn with revulsion. It's like a disease, she explained to Thomas as they paused on a ridge overlooking a valley that should have been lush with autumn grass, but instead stretched before them like a brown wasteland. But not a physical disease, a spiritual one. Something is literally eating the life force out of everything it touches. Samuel Wiseowl dismounted and knelt to examine the soil, his weathered hands probing the earth while his consciousness reached out to assess the spiritual damage. When he rose, his expression carried a mixture of anger and professional fascination. This is very sophisticated corruption, he reported. Whoever created this understands spiritual mechanics at a level that requires years of study. But the knowledge has been twisted, used to drain energy instead of nurturing it. This is why our traditional healing methods have failed. We have been trying to cure a wound while the knife remained in place, continuing to cut. The Kiowa guides led them to a concealed position where they could observe Blackthorn's facility without being detected. What Catherine saw there challenged everything she thought she understood about the relationship between spiritual knowledge and technological capability. The compound occupied a natural depression in the hills, hidden from casual observation, but clearly visible from their elevated vantage point. Several large buildings had been constructed with a combination of traditional materials and innovations Catherine had never seen before. But what drew her attention were the arrays of metal rods and crystalline formations that had been arranged in complex geometric patterns throughout the site. Those are spiritual amplifiers, Samuel whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and revulsion. I have heard of such things in stories passed down from the ancient teachers, but I never believed they could actually be constructed. They are designed to concentrate and redirect spiritual energy on a massive scale. Through a spyglass borrowed from Thomas Running Bear, Catherine could see figures moving through the compound, white men in the clothing of scientists or doctors, but also several individuals whose dress and appearance suggested they were indigenous people from various tribes. The implications of their presence were deeply disturbing. He's not working alone, Catherine observed, lowering the spyglass with a growing sense of dread. Those look like tribal medicine men, but they're cooperating with him willingly. How is that possible? One of the Kiowa guides, a young warrior named Swift Arrow, spoke bitterly in response to Catherine's question. Thomas translated with obvious distaste. He says that Blackthorn offers power to medicine men who feel their traditional authority is being threatened by white expansion. He promises them the ability to strike back at their enemies, to reclaim their people's dominance through superior spiritual technology. But the power he provides comes with a price that corrupts those who accept it. As they watched, a group of men emerged from the largest building, carrying what appeared to be a collection of crystalline devices. These were arranged in a new pattern near the center of the compound, and Catherine felt her spiritual senses scream in alarm as they began to pulse with malevolent energy. They're preparing another attack, she said urgently. I can feel the corruption gathering, getting ready to strike at a new target. We have to stop them. But even as she spoke, Catherine realized the enormous challenge they faced. Blackthorn's facility was heavily defended, not just by armed men, but by spiritual protections that could potentially corrupt or destroy anyone who approached with hostile intent. Her own abilities, powerful as they had proven to be, were still largely untested against deliberate spiritual warfare of this sophistication. Samuel Wise Owl seemed to read her thoughts, because he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder while speaking with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced seemingly impossible challenges before. The fire spirits did not bring you this far to abandon you when the real test begins, he said quietly. But this battle cannot be won through power alone. It will require wisdom, cunning, and the kind of courage that comes from understanding that some things are worth any sacrifice to protect. As they prepared to withdraw and plan their assault on Blackthorn's stronghold, Catherine felt the fire spirit power within her responding to the proximity of its corrupted opposite. The warmth in her chest grew stronger, more focused, as if preparing for a confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the spiritual health of the entire region that the Dr. Ezekiel Blackthorn had chosen to pervert the sacred knowledge of indigenous peoples for his own dark purposes. But he had never faced someone who carried the pure fire of the spirits themselves, someone who understood that true power came not from domination, but from harmony with the forces that sustained all life. The battle for the soul of the land was about to begin, and Catherine O'Sullivan, the red-haired girl once auctioned as the devil's daughter, would finally discover the true extent of the gifts that had marked her as sacred from birth. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after their reconnaissance of Blackthorn's facility, but not from the direction anyone expected. Catherine awakened to screams echoing across the Comanche village, not the war cries of approaching enemies, but the agonized shrieks of people in supernatural torment. She burst from her tipi to find a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The corruption wasn't advancing like a normal army, it was spreading like a spiritual plague, carried by figures that had once been human, but now moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes controlled by malevolent forces. At the head of this nightmare procession walked 3 medicine men, whose tribal origins Catherine couldn't identify, their traditional regalia twisted into mockeries of sacred dress, their eyes glowing with the sickly light of corrupted power. "Don't look directly at them." Samuel Wise Owl's voice cut through the chaos as he emerged from his lodge, already gathering the spiritual protections he would need for battle. "They carry the shadow corruption. Direct eye contact allows them to infect your spirit." Catherine forced herself to look away from the approaching horrors, focusing instead on the people around her who needed immediate help. Children were cowering in terror while adults struggled to organize a defense against enemies they couldn't understand. Several warriors had already fallen, not to physical wounds, but to some kind of spiritual assault that left them writhing on the ground in apparent agony. Dancing Cloud appeared at Catherine's side, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by grim determination. "The corrupted ones are targeting our medicine people first," she reported urgently. "They've already struck down Red Hawk and Morning Star. Samuel Wise Owl says they're trying to eliminate anyone who might be able to counter their magic." The implications hit Catherine like a physical blow. If Blackthorn's forces could neutralize the Comanche spiritual defenders, the village would be helpless against whatever horrors the corrupted medicine men intended to unleash. She was possibly the only person present with enough power to stand against them, but her training was incomplete and her experience with spiritual combat non-existent. "Where is Thomas Running Bear?" Catherine asked, trying to formulate some kind of plan from the chaos around her. "Leading the warriors and evacuating the non-combatants," Dancing Cloud replied. "But conventional weapons are useless against these enemies. We need spiritual power to fight spiritual corruption." Catherine felt the fire spirit energy within her responding to the proximity of its corrupted opposite, building to an intensity that made her skin feel like it was burning from the inside. But along with the power came a terrifying understanding. The corruption wasn't just trying to destroy the village, it was trying to infect her, to turn her own abilities against the people she had sworn to protect. "I need to get closer to them," she said, though every instinct screamed against approaching the nightmare figures advancing through the village. "I can't fight them effectively from a distance." Samuel Wiseowl appeared beside them, his arms full of sacred objects and his face painted with protective symbols Catherine had never seen before. "Fire Hair Woman, you must not attempt direct confrontation. These are not ordinary corrupted medicine men. They have been transformed into vessels for Blackthorn's power. Engaging them alone would be suicide." But even as he spoke, one of the corrupted figures turned toward their position, and Catherine felt the full force of its malevolent attention focus on her. The thing that had once been a human medicine man spoke in a voice that seemed to come from multiple throats at once, its words carrying power that made the air itself writhe with visible distortion. "Fire Spirit Child," it hissed, each syllable dripping with mockery and hatred. "Your master sends greetings. He has been very eager to meet the little Irish witch who thinks she can challenge powers beyond her comprehension." The creature raised one hand, and Catherine felt something like invisible claws raking across her spirit, trying to find purchase in her consciousness so it could plant seeds of corruption. Only the fire spirit power burning within her prevented the assault from succeeding, but the effort to resist left her staggering. "He offers you a choice," the corrupted medicine man continued, advancing with movements that hurt to watch. "Join him willingly and learn to use your gifts for purposes greater than healing grass and sick babies. Refuse and watch everyone you care about die in agony before you follow them into darkness." Catherine's response came not in words, but in action. She reached deep into the fire spirit power that had always burned within her, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known existed. The warmth in her chest exploded outward, surrounding her in a nimbus of golden light that made the corrupted creature recoil with what might have been pain. "I've already made my choice," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of life itself. "I choose to protect the people, no matter what it costs me." The battle that followed was unlike anything witnessed on the Great Plains before or since. Catherine found herself fighting not just 3 corrupted medicine men, but the entire spiritual infrastructure that Blackthorn had constructed to amplify and direct his power. Every attack she made was met by counterattacks that drew on energy sources far beyond what any individual could command, but she wasn't fighting alone. Samuel Wiseowl and the surviving Comanche medicine people formed a circle around her, adding their own power to hers while providing spiritual protection against the worst of the corruption's effects. Thomas Running Bear and his warriors created a physical barrier, using conventional weapons to destroy the corrupted creatures that served as vessels for Blackthorn's remote attacks. The turning point came when Catherine realized that she was fighting the battle on Blackthorn's terms, trying to match his corrupted power with pure energy. Instead, she needed to use the fundamental difference between her gifts and his twisted abilities. Where his power sought to dominate and corrupt, hers sought to heal and restore harmony. She stopped trying to destroy the corrupted medicine men and instead began trying to heal them, reaching past the spiritual contamination to touch whatever remained of their original human essence. The effort required her to open herself completely to the corruption's influence, risking infection in order to provide the cleansing fire that could burn away Blackthorn's control. The first corrupted medicine man collapsed as Catherine's healing fire burned through the spiritual chains that bound his will, his eyes clearing for just a moment before he died with what might have been gratitude. The second tried to flee as he felt his own corruption beginning to weaken, but Catherine's power followed him, offering redemption even as it destroyed the evil that had consumed his soul. The third and most powerful of the corrupted vessels proved more resistant, drawing on reserves of stolen power that seemed bottomless. But as Catherine poured more of her own life force into the healing fire, she began to sense something unexpected: fear from Blackthorn himself, transmitted through the spiritual link he maintained with his servants. "He's watching through their eyes," she gasped to Samuel Wise Owl during a brief lull in the battle. "He can see everything I'm doing, but it works both ways. I can sense his location, his defenses, his weaknesses." The revelation changed everything about their strategic situation. Instead of being trapped in a defensive battle against superior forces, they suddenly had intelligence about their enemy's stronghold and capabilities. But the knowledge came with a terrible price: maintaining the spiritual connection that provided. This information was slowly draining Catherine's life force. "You cannot sustain this level of power expenditure," Samuel warned as he saw Catherine beginning to weaken. "The fire spirits did not intend for you to burn yourself out in a single battle." But Catherine could see possibilities that her mentor couldn't perceive. Through her connection to the corrupted medicine man, she was learning about the true nature of Blackthorn's power. It wasn't unlimited. It depended on a network of spiritual amplifiers and corrupted human vessels that could be disrupted if she knew how to target them properly. "I need to get to his facility," she said, though the words came out as barely more than a whisper. "Not to destroy him directly, but to sever the connections that allow him to project power at a distance. If I can collapse his network, his corrupted servants will be freed, and his ability to attack from afar will be eliminated." The suggestion was met with immediate protests from everyone present. Blackthorn's compound was heavily defended, not just by conventional forces, but by spiritual traps that could kill or corrupt anyone who approached with hostile intent. Even if Catherine could somehow penetrate those defenses, she would be walking into the heart of enemy territory while already weakened by the current battle. But as they argued, more corrupted creatures began appearing at the edges of the village, drawn by the disturbance created by the spiritual battle. Catherine could sense dozens of them converging on their position, and she knew that the current defensive strategy couldn't sustain against such numbers. "This attack is just a distraction," she realized with growing horror. "Blackthorn is testing my abilities while positioning his real forces for a coordinated assault. If we stay here and fight defensively, we'll be overwhelmed within hours." The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. The only way to protect the Comanche village was to take the fight directly to Blackthorn before he could complete his preparations for total war. It was a desperate gambit that would require her to risk everything on a single assault, but the alternatives were even worse. "I'm going after him," Catherine announced, her voice carrying the finality of absolute commitment. "Tonight, while he's focused on coordinating the attack here. Samuel, I need you to teach me everything you know about spiritual protection in the next few hours. Thomas, I need a small team of your best warriors who are willing to ride into certain death for a chance to strike back at our enemies." The protests that followed were immediate and passionate, but Catherine had moved beyond the point where other people's opinions could influence her decision. The fire spirits had marked her for this confrontation from the moment of her birth, and all her suffering, the rejection by her own people, the auction block, the months of learning to control her gifts had been preparation for this ultimate test. As night fell over the embattled village, Catherine made her final preparations for a journey that would determine not just her own fate, but the spiritual future of the entire region. Blackthorn had chosen to wage war against the sacred forces that sustained all life, and now he would learn what happened when the fire spirits sent their chosen champion to deliver justice. The red-haired girl who had once been sold as the devil's daughter was about to fulfill the destiny that her hair had always proclaimed. Whether she survived the encounter or not, the corruption that threatened to poison the land itself would finally face a power that could not be bought, corrupted, or intimidated into submission. The fire spirit had chosen its vessel, and that vessel was ready to burn away the darkness that threatened to consume everything she had learned to love. The night that Catherine chose for her assault on Blackthorn's stronghold was moonless and bitter cold, with clouds thick enough to hide the movement of even a large war party across the prairie. She rode at the head of a force unlike any that had ever been assembled on the Great Plains. 12 Comanche warriors led by Thomas Running Bear, 8 Kiowa fighters under Striking Eagle's command, and Samuel Wise Owl carrying medicine bundles that contained the accumulated spiritual wisdom of generations. That the alliance between traditional enemies had been forged in desperation, but it was proving stronger than anyone had dared to hope. Comanche and Kiowa warriors who had spent their lives trying to kill each other now rode side by side, united by shared recognition that some threats transcended tribal boundaries. The corruption spreading from Blackthorn's facility would eventually consume everything if left unchecked, turning the entire Great Plains into a spiritual wasteland where nothing could live or grow. Catherine had spent the afternoon in intensive preparation with Samuel Wise Owl, learning protective techniques that pushed the boundaries of what her still developing abilities could handle. The elderly medicine man had painted her face and hands with symbols drawn in a mixture of red clay and sacred herbs, each mark designed to shield her from specific types of spiritual attack. But even with these protections, both of them knew that she would be walking into dangers that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. Remember, Samuel had instructed as he completed the ritual preparations, your greatest strength is also your greatest vulnerability. The fire spirit power within you burns so brightly that it will be visible to Blackthorn from great distances. He will know you are coming long before you reach his facility. But that same power is also the only thing capable of cleansing the corruption he has created. The war party had left the village just after sunset, following routes that avoided the areas where corrupted creatures were known to patrol. But as they approached Blackthorn's compound, the landscape around them grew increasingly hostile. The grass beneath their horses' hooves was brittle and lifeless, crackling like dry bones with each step. The air itself felt wrong, thick with a spiritual contamination that made breathing difficult and thinking clearly almost impossible. Catherine's newly developed spiritual senses were screaming warnings as they drew closer to their destination. She could perceive layers upon layers of defensive barriers surrounding Blackthorn's facility, each one designed to kill or corrupt anyone who attempted to breach the perimeter. But she could also sense something else, the presence of captured spirits, human souls that had been bound to serve as unwilling guardians for the compound. There are prisoners, she whispered to Thomas Running Bear as they paused on a ridge overlooking the enemy stronghold. Not just physical captives, but spirits that have been enslaved to power his defenses. Some of them feel familiar. I think they might be medicine people from various tribes who tried to oppose him and were captured. The intelligence changed their tactical planning completely. A direct assault would force Catherine to fight through defensive barriers powered by the tortured spirits of people who should have been their allies. But if she could somehow free those enslaved souls, Blackthorn's defenses would collapse and leave him vulnerable to conventional attack. Striking Eagle, who had been studying the compound through a captured spyglass, pointed toward a series of crystalline structures arranged in complex geometric patterns throughout the facility. Those must be the spiritual amplifiers Samuel told us about. But look at the way they pulse with light. Each one is connected to something that's struggling against its bonds. Catherine focused her enhanced perceptions on the crystal arrays, and immediately wished she hadn't. Each pulsing light represented a human soul being tortured to generate the energy needed to maintain Blackthorn's defenses. The agony of dozens of captured medicine people was being channeled into a network that protected their captor while ensuring their own continued suffering. I can feel their pain, she said, struggling to maintain her composure in the face of such systematic cruelty. They're still conscious, still aware of what's being done to them. How can any human being create such suffering deliberately? Thomas Running Bear's jaw tightened with anger that spoke of a warrior's understanding of honor and its violation. Because Blackthorn has abandoned his humanity in pursuit of power. Such men are more dangerous than any wild animal, because animals kill only from hunger or fear. Men like him kill because they enjoy the act of dominance itself. The rescue plan they developed was desperately risky, requiring Catherine to penetrate the compound alone while the warriors created diversions at multiple points around the perimeter. She would need to reach the central crystal array and somehow break the spiritual chains binding the captured souls, all while avoiding detection by Blackthorn and his remaining corrupted servants. As Catherine prepared to separate from the war party, Dancing Cloud appeared beside her horse, having apparently followed the expedition despite explicit orders to remain safely in the village. The young Comanche woman's face was painted with symbols that marked her as a spiritual guardian, and she carried a medicine bundle that Catherine had never seen before. "You cannot go alone," Dancing Cloud said firmly before anyone could protest. Her presence. "The spirits have shown me visions of what waits for you in that place. You will need an anchor to your own humanity, someone to call you back if the corruption tries to claim you. That is my purpose here." Thomas Running Bear started to object, but Samuel Wiseowl raised a hand for silence. The spirits do not send visions without purpose. If Dancing Cloud has been called to this place, then her presence is necessary for reasons we may not understand until the critical moment arrives. The final approach to Blackthorn's compound required them to cross nearly a mile of open ground while remaining undetected by both conventional sentries and spiritual surveillance. Catherine and Dancing Cloud moved together through the darkness, their painted faces and careful movements making them nearly invisible against the corrupted landscape. The first defensive barrier they encountered was a wall of pure malevolence that pressed against their minds like a physical weight, trying to fill their thoughts with despair and terror. Catherine felt her fire spirit power rising in response, creating a bubble of protective energy around both women. But maintaining the shield required constant effort that she knew she couldn't sustain indefinitely. "There," Dancing Cloud whispered, pointing toward a section of the compound where the crystalline formation seemed less densely arranged. "The spirits say that's where the captured souls are weakest in their bonds, where your fire might be able to break through without triggering all the defenses at once." They crept closer to the indicated area, passing between buildings that radiated spiritual corruption so intense it made Catherine's skin crawl. Through windows she could see laboratories where white men in doctors' coats worked with equipment that combined scientific instruments with objects that were clearly sacred items stolen from various tribes. The casual mixing of spiritual artifacts with mechanical devices spoke of a worldview that saw everything as raw material to be exploited rather than respected. The central crystal array rose from the compound's heart like a technological ziggurat, its multiple levels connected by metal walkways and crystalline conduits that pulsed with captured spiritual energy. But it was the sounds emanating from the structure that made Catherine's blood run cold, the whispered prayers and agonized chants of dozens of enslaved medicine people, their voices blending into a chorus of suffering that powered Blackthorn's entire operation. "I can see them," Catherine breathed, her enhanced spiritual vision allowing her to perceive the translucent forms of the captured souls suspended within the crystal matrix. They're still fighting, still trying to break free. But the bonds holding them are too strong for any individual to overcome. That was when Dancing Cloud revealed the true purpose of her presence. From her medicine bundle, she withdrew a collection of items that Catherine recognized as belonging to various tribal traditions: Kiowa prayer stones, Comanche sacred feathers, Cherokee healing crystals, and objects from nations she couldn't identify. Each item glowed with its own spiritual resonance, creating a harmony of power that transcended tribal boundaries. "The spirits have been preparing for this moment longer than any of us realized," Dancing Cloud explained as she began arranging the sacred objects in a pattern around their position. Every tribe that Blackthorn has attacked, every medicine person he has captured, has contributed something to this collection. Your fire will provide the power, but these will provide the harmony needed to break his corrupted network. As Dancing Cloud completed the arrangement, Catherine felt the fire spirit energy within her resonating with the assembled sacred objects in ways that amplified her power beyond anything she had experienced before. But more than that, she could sense the spiritual essence of every tribe represented in the collection, their combined wisdom and strength flowing through her like a river of living flame. The attack began not with violence, but with healing. Catherine reached out with her enhanced abilities, not trying to destroy Blackthorn's crystal array, but to restore the original nature of the enslaved souls trapped within it. Her fire spirit power, amplified by the harmonic resonance of the sacred objects, began to burn away the spiritual chains that bound the captured medicine people. The effect was immediate and dramatic. One by one, the enslaved souls began to break. Free from their crystalline prisons, their released energy destabilizing the entire defensive network. Alarms began sounding throughout the compound as Blackthorn's instruments detected the cascade failure of his carefully constructed system, but Catherine's success came at a terrible price. Each soul she freed took some of her own life force with it, and she could feel herself weakening as the number of liberated spirits grew. Dancing Cloud moved to support her as she swayed with exhaustion, but both women knew that Catherine had to continue until every captive was free, or she would lack the strength to complete the mission. "Fire hair, sister," Dancing Cloud whispered. "Urgently, someone is coming. The guards have detected our presence." Catherine looked up from her work to see armed men emerging from the compound's buildings, their faces showing the same sickly corruption that marked Blackthorn's other servants. But more disturbing was the figure walking among them, a tall man in a doctor's coat whose presence radiated the kind of intellectual evil that was far more dangerous than simple brutality. Dr. Ezekiel Blackthorn had finally come to confront the fire spirit woman who dared to challenge his dominion over the spiritual forces of the Great Plains. And as he approached their position with the confident stride of a man who believed himself invincible, Catherine realized that all her preparations and power might not be enough to overcome the accumulated corruption of his twisted genius. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the fate of every living thing on the Great Plains would be determined by the outcome of the battle between fire and shadow, healing and corruption, the sacred and the profane. Catherine O'Sullivan, the red-haired girl once sold as the devil's daughter, prepared to face the true devil who had chosen to make war against the spirits themselves. Dr. Ezekiel Blackthorn emerged from the shadows of his compound, like a nightmare given flesh, his tall frame wrapped in a coat that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face bore the pale, sunken features of a man who had traded his humanity for power, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who viewed all living things as experiments to be dissected. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured accent of an educated man corrupted by knowledge that should never have been pursued. "The famous fire woman," he said with mock politeness, stopping just beyond the range of Catherine's protective aura. "I must confess you've caused me considerable inconvenience. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to capture and bind the spirits of trained medicine people? Each one required months of careful preparation, and you've undone all my work in a single evening." Catherine struggled to her feet, supported by Dancing Cloud, but determined to face her enemy standing upright. The effort of freeing the enslaved souls had drained much of her strength, but the fire spirit power within her still burned with fierce intensity. Around them, the liberated spirits of captured medicine people swirled like aurora borealis, their grateful energy adding to Catherine's own power, while seeking ways to strike back at their former captor. "Those people weren't yours to capture," Catherine said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate with spiritual force. You perverted sacred knowledge to enslave the souls of healers and protectors. That's not power, it's abomination. Blackthorn laughed, a sound devoid of any human warmth. Spoken like someone who still believes in primitive superstitions about sacred and profane. I am a man of science. Miss O'Sullivan, I recognize only what works and what doesn't. Your primitive medicine people possessed abilities that could be harnessed for far greater purposes than healing sick children and growing crops. I simply found more efficient applications for their talents. As he spoke, Catherine became aware that Blackthorn wasn't alone. The corrupted servants surrounding him weren't just armed guards. They were the reanimated bodies of people who had died in his experiments, their souls trapped in flesh that no longer fully belonged to them. The sight filled her with a rage that transcended anything she had felt before, the fire spirit power responding to her emotion with heat that made the air around her shimmer. "You're not a scientist," she said, each word carrying more power than the last. "You're a grave robber and a soul thief. You steal what you're too weak to earn honestly, and you corrupt what you're too ignorant to understand properly." The insult struck home in ways that Catherine hadn't expected. Blackthorn's composure cracked slightly, revealing the insecurity, an inadequacy that drove his need to dominate others. "Weak?" He snarled, raising his hands to reveal gloves embedded with crystalline devices that pulsed with stolen spiritual energy. "I have harnessed powers that your savage friends couldn't even comprehend. I have turned their own medicine against them, used their sacred knowledge to build weapons they cannot resist." The battle that followed transcended physical combat, becoming a war between fundamentally opposed worldviews about the nature of power itself. Blackthorn attacked with spiritual weapons, powered by the tortured essence of his victims, trying to overwhelm Catherine with raw force amplified by technological enhancement. But Catherine fought with the harmony of willing cooperation, her fire spirit power strengthened by the gratitude of freed souls and the sacred objects Dancing Cloud had brought from multiple tribes. Blackthorn's first assault was a wave of pure corruption that sought to poison Catherine's connection to the fire spirits, to turn her own abilities against her by flooding them with spiritual contamination. The attack was sophisticated and brutal, designed by someone who understood both the mechanics of spiritual power and the psychological vulnerabilities of those who wielded it. But Catherine had learned something that Blackthorn could never understand. True spiritual power couldn't be corrupted, because it came from connection rather than domination. Where his abilities required the suffering of others to function, hers grew stronger when used to heal and protect. The corruption that should have overwhelmed her was instead burned away by the pure fire that had always marked her as sacred. "Impossible!" Blackthorn hissed as his attack failed to achieve its intended effect. "No individual spirit can resist the accumulated power I command. You should be screaming in agony by now, begging for the mercy of corruption to end your pain." Catherine's response came not in words, but in action. She reached out with her fire spirit power, not to attack Blackthorn directly, but to begin healing the spiritual wounds that his experiments had inflicted on the land itself. The brown, lifeless ground around his compound began to bloom with new grass, dead trees sprouted fresh leaves, and the corrupted air started to clear as natural spiritual balance reasserted itself. The effect on Blackthorn's power base was immediate and devastating. His abilities depended on spiritual corruption to function, drawing strength from the suffering and contamination he had spread across the region. As Catherine healed the damage he had done, his accumulated power began to drain away like water from a broken vessel. "You don't understand," Blackthorn screamed, his composure completely shattered as he felt his carefully constructed dominion collapsing. "I was trying to save this land from the primitive ignorance that's holding it back. I was going to use spiritual power to build a new civilization, one based on scientific principles rather than savage superstition." Dancing Cloud spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. her voice carrying the wisdom of generations who had lived in harmony with the spiritual forces Blackthorn sought to exploit. You cannot save something by destroying its essence. You cannot build life from death, or harmony from suffering. The spirits reject your offerings because you have nothing of value to give. As if responding to her words, the liberated souls of the enslaved medicine people began to gather around Blackthorn, not to attack him, but to bear witness to his judgment. These were people he had tortured and killed in pursuit of power, and their presence created a spiritual pressure that his corrupted abilities couldn't resist. Blackthorn made one final, desperate attempt to reassert control, drawing on reserves of stolen power that should have been enough to destroy everything within miles of his position. The crystalline devices embedded in his gloves flared with light so intense it hurt to look at directly, and the air around him began to writhe with energies that threatened to tear reality itself apart. But Catherine was ready for this last gambit. Drawing on everything Samuel Wiseowl had taught her about spiritual harmony, she didn't try to match Blackthorn's power with equal force. Instead, she offered something he had forgotten existed: forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. The fire spirit energy she directed toward him carried no hatred or desire for revenge, only the pure intention to heal whatever spiritual wounds had driven him to such extremes of evil. It was the same power she had used to restore poisoned grassland and heal sick children, applied now to the most corrupted soul she had ever encountered. The effect was unlike anything either combatant had expected. Blackthorn's stolen power, which depended on spiritual corruption to maintain coherence, began to unravel when exposed to pure healing energy. But more than that, the crystalline devices that amplified his abilities started to crack and shatter as they tried to channel forces that were fundamentally incompatible with their corrupted matrices. "What are you doing to me?" Blackthorn gasped as his enhanced abilities began to fail. I can feel them leaving me. All the power, all the knowledge I've accumulated, it's burning away." Catherine stepped closer, her red hair seeming to blaze with inner fire as she extended one hand toward her enemy. "I'm giving you the same thing I've given everyone else: a chance to choose healing over corruption, connection over domination. Your power was always borrowed from others. Now you can discover what you're capable of when you stop stealing from the spirits and start working with them." For a moment, Blackthorn seemed to waver on the edge of a decision that could have changed everything. The corrupted devices fell from his hands as their power sources collapsed, and Catherine could see in his eyes a flicker of the man he might have been before ambition and fear had led him down such a dark path. But the moment passed. Years of choosing corruption over harmony had left Blackthorn unable to accept redemption even when it was offered freely. "I would rather die than submit to primitive superstition," he snarled, pulling a conventional pistol from his coat and aiming it directly at Catherine's heart. The shot that followed echoed across the compound like thunder, but it wasn't Blackthorn who fired. Thomas Running Bear's rifle spoke from the shadows where the war party had been waiting for their chance to strike, and the doctor crumpled to the ground with the surprised expression of a man who had forgotten that spiritual power didn't make him immune to physical death. As Blackthorn died, his remaining corrupted servants collapsed like marionettes with cut strings, their artificial animation ending with their master's defeat. The crystalline arrays throughout the compound began to crack and shatter, releasing the last traces of stolen spiritual energy back to the earth where it belonged. Catherine knelt beside Blackthorn's body, not out of sorrow for his death, but out of sadness for the choices that had led him to such a fate. "He could have been a bridge between worlds," she said quietly. "He had the intelligence and education to help white settlers understand spiritual truth instead of fearing it. But he chose domination over cooperation, and it destroyed him." The liberation of Blackthorn's compound marked the beginning of a new era for the Great Plains. With the source of spiritual corruption eliminated, The poisoned grasslands began to heal with supernatural speed. Rivers ran clear again, animals returned to areas they had fled, and the various tribal communities that had been under attack could finally begin to rebuild. But perhaps more importantly, the alliance forged between Comanche and Kiowa in the face of common threat proved that ancient enemies could become partners when they recognized shared interests. The success of their cooperation inspired similar alliances throughout the region, creating a network of mutual support that was far stronger than any individual tribe could have achieved alone. Catherine found her place as a bridge between worlds, using her unique position to facilitate understanding between tribal communities and the white settlers who continued to arrive in the region. Her red hair, once seen as the devil's mark, became a symbol of hope for people from all backgrounds who sought to build harmonious relationships rather than repeating the cycles of violence that had characterized frontier expansion. Years later, when Catherine had grown into a legendary figure whose story was told around campfires from Texas to Montana, people would debate whether she had been blessed by spirits, cursed by demons, or simply possessed of unusual natural abilities. But for those who had known her personally, the truth was simpler and more profound. Catherine O'Sullivan had been chosen by forces greater than human, understanding to demonstrate that differences were not defects to be corrected, but gifts to be celebrated. Her red hair had marked her as special from birth, but it was her choices to embrace her nature rather than deny it, to serve others rather than herself, to heal rather than harm, that had made her truly sacred. The girl who had once been auctioned as the devil's daughter had become the fire spirit woman, a bridge between worlds and a guardian of the sacred forces that sustained all life. And in healing the land from Blackthorn's corruption, she had proved that the greatest power of all was the simple decision to choose love over fear, harmony over domination, and hope over despair. The fire spirits had chosen their vessel well, and the legacy of that choice would burn bright for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.